The air inside the Blue Ridge precinct was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and cheap cologne. Officers moved about in clusters, sharing laughter, swapping stories, and filing reports like any other routine day. But they had no idea. This wasn't just any other day. A man walked in, blending seamlessly into the mundane chaos, dressed in a faded plaid shirt, scuffed jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. He looked like an ordinary civilian, maybe someone lost or seeking help. No one gave him a second glance. That was exactly what he wanted. Richard Nelson, the newly appointed chief of police, had entered his own precinct in disguise. The appointment had been sudden, announced only a few days prior. Richard had refused the usual fanfare of welcome receptions and official introductions. He wasn't interested in rehearsed handshakes or politically polished smiles. He wanted to see his department for what it really was: unfiltered, raw, and honest. He had spent over 2 decades in law enforcement, fighting for justice in a system that often resisted change. But Blue Ridge was different. Whispers of corruption, deep-seated bias, and unchecked misconduct had tainted the precinct for years. It wasn't just a job for him. It was a battleground. And today he was walking straight into enemy territory. Richard moved with calculated slowness, scanning the precinct as he walked past rows of desks. Officers leaned back in chairs, boots propped up on desks, cracking jokes loud enough to echo down the halls. Some were buried in paperwork, but others were too comfortable in their little world of unchecked power. In the corner, 2 officers stood whispering. Their hushed conversation was just loud enough for him to catch snippets. Dude just got away with it. Internal affairs? Pfft, they're a joke. Richard's jaw tightened. No accountability. No fear of consequences. Exactly what he had suspected. He kept moving. A female officer brushed past him without so much as a glance. Near the break room, a group of officers stood in a tight huddle laughing. Their eyes flickered to him briefly before dismissing him entirely. Good. They didn't see him as a threat. Then it happened. Hey. A sharp voice sliced through the air, cutting through the noise like a blade. Richard turned. A tall, broad-shouldered white officer was striding toward him. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the harsh, fluorescent lights. His name tag read Daniels. Richard didn't blink. He had read the reports. Officer Daniels was a name that had appeared too many times in complaints: excessive force, intimidation, misconduct. But like so many before him, he had always slipped through the cracks. Daniels stopped a foot away, looking him up and down with a smirk. You lost, old man? The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Richard said nothing. He simply held the officer's gaze. Daniels chuckled, glancing over his shoulder at the other officers, who were now watching with amused expressions. He turned back to Richard, his smirk widening. This ain't a shelter. You need to take that mess somewhere else, he said, his voice dripping with casual cruelty. Richard clenched his fists at his sides. He knew this type. The kind who thrived on power, who relished the idea of belittling someone they assumed to be weaker. When Richard didn't immediately move, Daniel's smirk faltered. He stepped in closer. I said. Then, without warning, Daniel spat in his face. The world seemed to stop. The warm, vile sensation of saliva trailed down Richard's cheek. Laughter erupted from the officers behind Daniels. One of them whistled low, another clapped, thoroughly entertained by the humiliation playing out in front of them. Richard's pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the slow, creeping burn of anger. But he didn't react. Not yet. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped his face. Every movement was measured, controlled. He refused to let them see him flinch. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet but firm. Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors? Daniel scoffed, his arrogance unshaken. "Only the ones who don't belong here." The laughter grew louder. Richard took a breath, a slow, steady breath. His time would come. Without another word, he turned and walked down the hall, leaving the laughter behind. As he disappeared around the corner, the intercom crackled to life, cutting through the noise. "All personnel report to the briefing room. Mandatory meeting in 5 minutes." A meeting that would change everything. The air in the precinct felt heavier, now thick with an unspoken hostility. The laughter still echoed in the background, a cruel, hollow sound that grated against Richard's patience. He had seen men like Daniels before, officers who thrived in a culture of unchecked arrogance, who wielded their authority like a weapon, believing themselves untouchable. Daniels took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. His smirk deepened, enjoying the moment, enjoying the power he thought he had. "I don't think you heard me," Daniels said, his voice laced with mock concern. "You need to get out of here. Now." Richard remained still. His heartbeat was steady, his expression unreadable. He had learned long ago that reacting to men like this only fed their egos. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, watching, assessing. Daniels scoffed. "Oh, you think you belong here?" He gestured vaguely to the bustling precinct behind him. "I don't know what you're doing wandering around, but we don't need any trouble. And you—" He let his eyes drift over Richard's worn-out clothes. "You look like trouble." From the corner of his eye, Richard noticed the other officers watching, their amusement barely concealed. Some leaned against desks, arms folded, whispering among themselves. A few chuckled, exchanging knowing glances as if they had seen this before, a show they had no intention of stopping. Daniels turned slightly, addressing his fellow officers. "What do you guys think? Should we call him a cab? Maybe drop him off at the nearest soup kitchen?" More laughter. Richard felt his pulse tighten, but outwardly he remained composed. Daniels, however, wasn't done. "Or," he mused, his voice dripping with fake sympathy, "maybe you should be somewhere else, old man. You know, somewhere where people like you actually belong." Richard exhaled slowly through his nose. The words weren't surprising. He had dealt with men like Daniels his entire career, men who wielded their authority with bias, who let their personal prejudices shape how they treated people. And in that moment, Daniels made a choice he would regret. Daniels leaned in close. "Didn't you hear me?" His voice dropped just enough to sound more like a threat than a question. Then, in one swift motion, he spit. Richard barely flinched as the warm saliva struck his cheek, sliding down in a slow, sickening trail. A moment of stunned silence hung in the air before the room erupted into laughter. One officer slapped his knee, another whistled low, muttering something Richard couldn't make out over the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Daniels leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, his smirk widened. He had won, or so he thought. Richard could feel the burn of humiliation clawing at his chest, the anger coiling tight in his stomach. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to react, to wipe that smug look off Daniels's face, to demand respect in the way that men like him understood best. But he didn't. Instead, he moved slowly, calm, deliberate, controlled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, unfolding it with the precision of a man who refused to be rattled. The laughter around him began to die down as he wiped his face clean, each motion precise, unhurried. He took his time, and when he was done, he folded the handkerchief neatly, tucking it back into his pocket as though nothing had happened. Then at last, he spoke. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" His voice was calm, too calm. Daniels narrowed his eyes as if trying to figure out why his target wasn't reacting the way he had expected. "Only the ones who don't belong here," he said, his voice sharp, still laced with mockery. Another chuckle rippled through the room, though now some officers shifted uncomfortably. The weight in Richard's words, the unshaken composure in his stance, it was unsettling. Richard held Daniels's gaze for a long moment, then did something that made the officer falter. He smiled, not a wide, obvious smile, just a slight upturn of his lips, a knowing expression that sent a ripple of unease through the air, and without another word he turned and walked away. The precinct was still alive with noise, the chatter of dispatch, the occasional ringing of phones, but for those who had witnessed what had just happened, everything felt off. Richard's footsteps echoed as he walked down the hallway. He didn't rush. He didn't look back. The laughter behind him had faded into a tense, confused silence. Daniel, still standing near the break room, frowned. "That's it?" he muttered under his breath. He had expected anger, yelling, a confrontation, something, but the way Richard had just walked away, without a reaction, without giving him the satisfaction of even acknowledging the insult, felt more unsettling than any outburst ever could. One of the officers near Daniel shifted, clearing his throat. Who was that guy anyway?" Before anyone could answer, the overhead intercom crackled to life. "All personnel report to the briefing room immediately. Mandatory meeting in 5 minutes." Richard kept walking, because the moment they stepped into that briefing room, everything would change. The overhead speakers buzzed with static before the announcement repeated, "All personnel report to the briefing room immediately. Mandatory meeting in 5 minutes." Richard kept walking, his pace steady, his expression unreadable. His heart pounded, not with nerves, but with anticipation. The moment had arrived. The precinct's briefing room was large, with rows of chairs lined up before a central podium. As officers trickled in, the usual energy of casual banter filled the space. Coffee cups in hand, some exchanged jokes, others leaned against the walls, scrolling through their phones. Daniel strolled in, shoulders squared, his confidence unwavering. To him, this was just another dull meeting, another routine announcement. He had no idea his world was about to collapse around him. At the front of the room, Captain Harris stood waiting. A stout man with graying hair and sharp eyes. He was one of the few officers in the department Richard actually trusted. Harris cleared his throat and called for attention. "All right, settle down," he said, his voice carrying authority. "We've got an important introduction today." The room quieted, conversations dwindling to whispers. Daniels leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, a smug expression still playing on his lips. "As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month," Harris continued, "and we've been waiting for his replacement." Richard took a deep breath. It was time. Harris gestured toward the side entrance. "And now I'd like to introduce our new chief of police." The door opened. Richard stepped through. For a split second, the room remained still. Officers stared, their expressions blank, uncomprehending. Then recognition flickered in their eyes. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some officers sat up straighter. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel's smirk faltered. Richard walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the podium, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to glare. His presence alone commanded the room. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Richard reached the podium and placed a folder on it. He let the moment sink in. He wanted them to feel it, the weight of their actions, the weight of their assumptions. Daniel's face drained of color. His posture stiffened. He looked like a man who had just realized he had set fire to the very ground he was standing on. Richard lifted his chin, scanning the room, letting his gaze land on each and every officer. Some looked away. Others swallowed hard. Then at last, he spoke. "Good morning." His voice was steady. "My name is Richard Nelson." A beat of silence. "As of today, I am your new chief of police." Daniels flinched. His breath hitched. The room was dead silent. Richard let his words settle in, the impact spreading like a slow-burning fire. He could see the shift, the growing discomfort, the realization dawning in their eyes. He took his time, locking eyes with Daniels for just a second longer than necessary before looking away, making the officer feel the weight of his presence. No one was laughing now. A few officers sat frozen as if waiting for someone to break the silence. Others shifted in their seats, their eyes darting toward Daniels, whose jaw was clenched so tightly his teeth might shatter. Richard allowed the tension to linger. He wanted them to feel it. He adjusted the microphone slightly, his movements calm, measured. "When I arrived this morning," he continued, "I came in plain clothes. No badge, no uniform, no announcements." A murmur rolled through the crowd, uncertain and uneasy. I wanted to see this department as it truly is, not the polished version that's presented in meetings, not the rehearsed professionalism that's put on display when officials are watching. His voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet intensity that made every syllable feel heavier. I wanted to see how my officers treated people when they thought no one important was looking. A shift, the weight of his words pressing down on them. He took a slow step away from the podium, moving toward the front row of officers. "And what I saw," he said, "was eye-opening." No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Daniel's hands curled into fists at his sides. Richard let his gaze sweep over the room. He could see it now, the guilt flickering in some of their eyes, the anxiety creeping up in others. They knew what he was talking about. But instead of calling it out directly, he let the silence do the work. He turned back to the podium, placing both hands on it. "In my brief time here, I have already witnessed behavior that is not only unprofessional, but completely unacceptable." A few officers glanced toward Daniels now, waiting, dreading what would come next. Richard's voice dropped slightly. "And let me make one thing clear." He leaned in slightly. "That ends today." The tension in the room coiled so tightly it felt like it might snap. Daniel shifted, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. For the first time that morning, his arrogance had completely evaporated. Richard straightened and folded his hands in front of him. "This precinct will not be a place where bias thrives," he said. "It will not be a place where disrespect is ignored. It will not be a place where power is used as a tool to degrade others." His tone remained calm, but the authority in it was absolute. "If you cannot uphold the values of integrity and respect, then this is not the place for you." The silence was suffocating now. Daniels looked like he wanted to disappear. Richard took one last breath, then delivered the final blow. "And if anyone has a problem with that, my office is open." The message was clear. This wasn't a speech, it was a declaration. Things were going to change. And for the first time since he had stepped into that precinct, Richard could see it. Fear. Not fear of a man, but fear of accountability. Fear that the old ways were dying, because they were, and he was here to bury them. The weight of Richard Nelson's words lingered in the air, suffocating and inescapable. No one spoke. No one dared. The room was still. Officers sat frozen in their chairs, eyes darting between one another, waiting, dreading what would come next. Richard let the silence stretch. Let them feel it. He knew the power of silence, knew how it forced people to confront the truth, to sit in their discomfort. And right now, that truth was burning its way into every officer in that room. Finally, he took a slow breath, his voice breaking the hush like the crack of a gavel. "This department is broken." Murmurs rippled through the room, uneasy shifts in seats, but no one challenged him. "Some of you may not want to hear that," he continued. "Some of you may want to believe that this precinct is operating just fine, that the way things have always been done is the way they should be done. He paused, scanning the room. But I spent this morning watching, listening, and what I saw was not a department built on service or integrity. It was a department built on power. His words hit like hammer blows. A few officers looked down at their laps. Others stared straight ahead, stiff as statues. Richard leaned forward slightly. And power without accountability, that's corruption. His eyes found Daniel's. Daniel's was still standing near the back, shoulders squared, jaw clenched so tight his teeth might shatter. But beneath the bravado, Richard could see it, the fear, the certainty that his time was up. Richard stepped out from behind the podium and took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Officer Daniels. The entire room seemed to shrink. Daniels flinched just slightly before schooling his expression into something harder, colder. But Richard wasn't interested in his defense. "You represent everything that is wrong with this department," Richard said, his voice calm, controlled. "When you spat in my face, you weren't just disrespecting me. You were disrespecting this badge." Daniel swallowed, but Richard wasn't done. "You were disrespecting the oath you took. You were disrespecting the very people you claim to protect." The silence in the room was deafening. Officers shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. No one defended Daniels. Richard let his gaze sweep over the other officers. "And the worst part," he continued, "most of you laughed." A few officers looked away, guilt creeping into their expressions. "You stood by," Richard pressed on. "You watched it happen. You let it happen. Because in this precinct, that kind of behavior isn't just tolerated, it's encouraged. More shifting, more tension." Richard exhaled. "That ends today." The punishment, he turned back to Daniels. "As of this moment, you are suspended pending an internal investigation into your conduct." Gasps rippled through the room. Daniel's face flushed a deep, angry red. "Chief, No." Richard cut him off sharply. His voice wasn't loud, but it was absolute. "You don't get to speak. You had your chance to show your character, and you did, and now you're going to face the consequences." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. His chest rose and fell in heavy, angry breaths. He looked to the other officers, searching for someone, anyone, to defend him. No one did. His reputation, his unchecked authority, had shattered in an instant. Richard turned away from him, back to the room. "And for the rest of you," his gaze swept over them, unwavering, "consider this your wake-up call." A few officers stiffened. "I don't care how long you've been here. I don't care how high your rank is. If you cannot operate with integrity, if you cannot serve with respect, if you think this badge gives you the right to abuse your power," he let the weight of his words settle in, "then this is not the place for you." The silence in the room was suffocating. Richard took a slow breath, easing some of the intensity from his tone. "I know change isn't easy," he admitted. "I know that for some of you this is the only way you've ever known how to do this job. But understand this, we are not at war with the people we serve. We are here to protect them, to be the ones they turn to, not the ones they fear." Because he knew what was coming. When the lawyer finally finished, Richard slid a file across the table. And just like that, Daniels' smirk disappeared. His lawyer frowned, flipping through the pages. The more she read, the more her expression darkened. "Chief Nelson," she said carefully, "these records are verified, every single one." Richard leaned forward slightly. "And they never should have been buried in the first place." Daniels' face paled. He gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. Richard didn't take his eyes off him. "You want to talk about wrongful treatment?" Richard said, voice controlled. "Fine. Let's talk about every person you wrongfully arrested, every civilian who walked away from an encounter with you humiliated, terrified, or hurt. Let's talk about the fact that you've been shielded for years." Daniels opened his mouth, but Richard didn't let him speak. "No," he said coldly. "For once, you're going to listen." Daniels shut his mouth. Richard looked around the room at the officers sitting in on the hearing. Some refused to meet his gaze. Others looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. But no one defended Daniels, not anymore. 2 days later, the verdict was official. Daniels's appeal? Denied. His career? Over. He walked out of the precinct that afternoon with nothing but a box of his personal belongings. No ceremony, no goodbyes. Richard watched from his office window as Daniels pushed through the front doors and stepped into the blinding sunlight. He hesitated on the steps, looking around, waiting for someone to acknowledge him. No one did. His once loyal circle had already distanced themselves, fearful of their own futures. And just like that, Daniels was gone. The news spread like wildfire. Daniels, the once untouchable, had fallen. Some officers took it as a warning, their postures shifting whenever Richard walked past. Others, those who had once admired Daniels, moved more carefully now, realizing that their paths might be next. And then there were the ones who exhaled in relief. Officer Reyes, a young recruit, knocked on Richard's door that evening. She hesitated before stepping inside. "I just wanted to say thank you, Chief," she said quietly. Richard looked up. "For what?" "For proving we're not untouchable," she admitted, "for reminding us why we wear the badge." Richard studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. "That's the job, Officer Reyes." She nodded back and turned to leave, but before she stepped out, she hesitated again. "For what it's worth, sir," she said, glancing over her shoulder, "I think some of them want to change. They just don't know how." Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That's where we start then," he murmured. She gave a small smile and left. Richard sat in silence for a long time. Daniels was gone, but the real work was just beginning. The precinct had changed, but the air was still thick with uncertainty. Daniels was gone, but his absence didn't erase the years of unchecked behavior that had poisoned the culture of the department. Richard knew this wasn't a victory. It was just the beginning. Change wasn't just about getting rid of bad cops. It was about rebuilding trust, reshaping the foundation of what this precinct stood for. And that wasn't something that could happen overnight. Richard had expected resistance. He had expected some officers to dig in, to fight against the new standard. But what surprised him were the ones who wanted to do better. One morning, as Richard made his usual rounds through the precinct, Officer Reyes stopped him in the hallway. "Chief?" She hesitated, shifting on her feet. He raised an eyebrow. "Yes, officer?" She cleared her throat. "I just wanted to say that I appreciate what you're doing here." Richard studied her, waiting. She exhaled. "I've been here 3 years. When I first started, I saw things that didn't sit right with me, but I was too scared to speak up. I thought if I didn't laugh along, I'd be next." Her hands clenched at her sides. "I should have done something, but I didn't." Richard could hear the shame in her voice. "You're doing something now," he said simply. She looked up, surprised. He continued, "Recognizing the problem is the first step. The next step is deciding who you want to be moving forward." Reyes swallowed and nodded. "I want to be better, Chief." Richard gave a small nod. "Then be better, and hold others accountable while you're at it." She straightened her posture. "Yes, sir." Richard watched as she walked away, determination set in her features. It was a small moment, but it mattered. Cleaning up the precinct was one battle, but outside these walls another war was raging. The community had long lost faith in the police. Years of misconduct, harassment, and abuse had turned the people of Blue Ridge against those in uniform, and Richard knew that trust, once broken, was not easily rebuilt, but he also knew he had to try. So, when a local community leader invited him to speak at a neighborhood event, he didn't hesitate. That Saturday, he walked into a crowded park where families gathered. Food vendors lined the sidewalks, and music played in the background. But the moment people spotted his uniform, conversations died. Mothers pulled their children closer. Young men stared with narrowed eyes. Some turned their backs entirely. Richard wasn't surprised. He didn't try to force a smile, didn't try to demand their attention. He simply stood there, waiting. Finally, an older man approached him. "Chief Nelson," the man greeted, his tone careful. "I'm Pastor Williams." Richard extended a hand. "Pastor." The man studied him before shaking his hand. "You sure you want to be here?" "I don't just want to be here," Richard said. "I need to be here." The pastor gave a slow nod. "Then let's talk." They sat beneath a pavilion surrounded by skeptical onlookers. "I won't lie to you, Chief," Pastor Williams said, folding his hands on the table. "People don't trust you, not because of who you are, but because of what that uniform represents." Richard nodded. "I understand." "No," the pastor said, shaking his head. "I don't think you do. I've buried boys because of that uniform." His voice was heavy with pain. "I've counseled families torn apart by police violence. I've stood in this very park and watched officers harass our kids for no reason." Richard didn't argue. He listened. Finally, he spoke. "I can't change the past, Pastor, but I can promise you this: I will do everything in my power to change the future." The pastor studied him. "Words are easy, Chief. Actions, that's what matters." Richard exhaled. "Then watch me." A flicker of something, respect maybe, passed through the pastor's eyes. "We'll see," he said. As Richard stood to leave, a small tug at his sleeve stopped him. He looked down to see a young boy, no older than 8, staring up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Richard knelt to his level. "Hey there." The boy hesitated before speaking. "Are you really the chief?" Richard smiled. "That's what they tell me." The boy bit his lip. "My dad says the police don't care about us." Richard's chest tightened. "What do you think?" Richard asked gently. The boy looked down at his sneakers. "I don't know." Richard nodded. "That's fair." He pulled out a small notepad from his pocket, scribbling something down before tearing the page and handing it to the boy. "If you ever need help," Richard said, "you come find me, okay?" The boy took the paper carefully, holding it like it was something fragile. Richard gave him a reassuring smile. "You deserve to feel safe, and I'm going to do my best to make sure you do." For the first time, the boy smiled back. As Richard left the park that evening, the weight of his mission pressed heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about fixing a department. It wasn't just about firing bad cops or making new rules. This was about rebuilding something that had been broken for years. Trust, hope, belief that justice wasn't just a word, but something real, something worth fighting for. As he drove back to the precinct, he knew one thing for certain: the road ahead would be tough. But backing down? That was never an option. The Blue Ridge precinct was no longer the same place Richard Nelson had walked into a year ago. The walls still stood, the desks still lined the same rows, but the air inside, that had changed. There was no more unchecked arrogance, no more casual cruelty disguised as brotherhood, no more officers operating with the belief that the badge granted them immunity from accountability. That didn't mean everything was perfect. Far from it. Richard had lost officers, some who quit, unwilling to adapt, and others who had been removed, their past finally catching up with them. The cleanup had been brutal. But for every officer lost, there was a new recruit stepping through those doors, carrying something this department had lacked for years: integrity. And as Richard stood in the hallway watching the precinct shift change, he knew one thing for certain: it had been worth it. Morning briefings weren't the same anymore. Gone were the days of laughter at someone else's expense, of whispered conversations meant to isolate and control. Now officers sat with purpose, their eyes alert, their conversations focused on what actually mattered, the job. Not everyone who remained was perfect, but they were learning. Some of the older officers, the ones who had survived the shift in leadership, were adapting in their own way. They spoke more carefully, they listened more, and most importantly, they started holding each other accountable. Richard had watched it happen in small moments, an officer stopping another before he said something out of line, a veteran pulling a rookie aside to teach rather than belittle. It was slow, messy, imperfect, but it was real. The culture of the precinct had started to shift, not out of fear, but out of an understanding that things had to be different. Richard had expected resistance. He had expected to lose people, and he had. Some officers had turned in their badges the moment Daniels's appeal was denied, refusing to work under a chief who didn't have their backs. Richard hadn't stopped them, because what they really meant was they didn't want to work in a department where they couldn't operate unchecked. Good riddance. But then there were the others, the ones who had stayed, who had been unsure at first. Officers like Reyes, who had once remained silent, but now spoke up when something felt wrong. Officers who had been part of the problem, but had chosen to change. One of them, Officer Grant, had been in the department for nearly 20 years. He had been close to Daniels, part of the old regime, a man who had once believed in the us versus them mentality. But over the past year, Richard had watched him shift. One afternoon, Grant knocked on Richard's office door. "Chief," he said, hesitating. "Got a minute?" Richard motioned for him to sit. Grant exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I won't lie to you. When you first got here, I thought about leaving." Richard folded his hands. "What changed?" Grant shook his head. "I started paying attention." He looked Richard dead in the eye. "To you, to the new recruits, to the way people trusted us again." A beat of silence passed. "Never thought I'd say this, Chief," Grant admitted, "but I'm glad I stayed." Richard nodded, offering a small smile. "Me too. Not everyone could be saved, but some could." One evening, Richard found himself standing in the main hallway, watching as officers filed out at the end of their shifts. Some greeted him as they passed. Others gave him respectful nods. No one avoided eye contact anymore. The laughter and camaraderie that filled the precinct now, it wasn't forced. It wasn't at the expense of others. It was genuine. The toxic air that had once suffocated this place had lifted, replaced by something else. Hope. Richard exhaled, taking it all in. Had they fixed everything? Number. There were still challenges ahead. There were still officers who struggled with the transition. There were still deep wounds between the department and the community that wouldn't heal overnight. But they were trying, and that was more than he had ever hoped for. As he walked toward his office, he thought about everything that had happened over the past year, the battles fought, the trust lost and regained, the ones who had stood against him and the ones who had stood beside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them. It was about the future of this department. It was about what kind of officers they chose to be. Richard stopped at his office door and turned, looking at the precinct one last time before shutting off the lights. And then, almost as if speaking to every officer, every civilian, every person who had ever felt like the system had failed them, he asked the question that mattered most. What would you do in this situation?